Okay, so this is part two. Once again, I was going to try to break these out so they wouldn't be so long. I think the first one was like 11 minutes, and I did switch over to Chrome, so hopefully this will work a little bit better. But what you're going to be looking at is this first one, and it has to do, let me get that in focus there, it has to do with general industry and how to read the standards. And so if you could follow along with me on that. And then I am also going to go ahead and switch over to this and kind of show you kind of what I'm talking about with regard to this. Okay, so I know this says handout 8A. This is given to us by OSHA. They essentially at one point they said, hey, you need to train this way. They gave some forms out. Since at that time they've said, okay, well, now we don't need to do that, but this form is really good. I love it, and that's the reason why I want to go ahead and go through these with you separately. Okay, so once again we're on the second page. It's just the how to read the OSHA standards, and we're just at the general industry. As you can see here, they have subparts, and so when we read the numbers, and I'm kind of highlighting it here just so that you can see it, 29 is actually the title number, and the CFR means Code of Federal Regulations. It used to be a long time ago that the Code of Federal Regulations was printed, and you had to have those out all the time just to read those. Okay, I went ahead and paused that video because I did want to show you. This actually used to be the Code of Federal Regulations. This is how we as safety managers a long time ago, this says through 1996, so that's totally dating me there. But we had to look up the regulations, and when we looked up the regulations, we would have to go through, I don't know if you can see that, but we would have to go through and read exactly what was said on that. This table, when we look at it, has to do with outdoor exposures. This whole thing here, this is the labor part, and so this is part 1910, and this would come out quarterly, and so we would make sure that we read up to date. Emails were out, and they would tell us exactly what we needed to do, what changes were out there, but a lot of times if we wanted to know something, we just had to pick up the book and read it. Nowadays, we go into OSHA.gov, go to general industry, and we can typically type some information in there, and I'll kind of show you how that is here at the very end when we talk about it. Okay, so once again, the CFR is the Code of Federal Regulations that's stated out there. The 1910 is the part number, and so the 1910 is the part number for general industry, and I'll go ahead and show you here in just a minute what construction and that is. But typically if someone says 1910, we go, oh, that's general industry, or if they say general industry, we go, oh, that's 1910. So that's where that is. The next thing here is this is the section number, and typically it'll have a dot or a period and then whatever number that is. I don't expect you to memorize those. I don't have a lot of them memorized. I can generally get to where that is. But what's good about the OSHA regulations is there's an index and then a find, but you can find that on the OSHA website. Then it goes into a series. When we start looking at it, lowercase alpha numbers, Roman numbers, and italicized, and all of that. And so when we ask for the OSHA standard, make sure that you list the whole thing. Not necessary do you have to put 29 CFR, but if we were looking at this OSHA standard here, well, not that. But we were looking at this OSHA standard here, and this has to do with portable containers shall not be taken into buildings except as provided by, and then paragraph. If I asked for that, you would type in 1910.110 paren B paren 13 and so forth. Okay, that would be the whole thing. Now the other deal with OSHA is they've kind of grouped different things together. And sometimes they make sense, sometimes you think that they should be in another area. But as you can see up here, there's something called subparts. And once again, I'm not going to make you memorize these. There is a worksheet that will be online, so you can go in and actually look to see with regard to that worksheet, and it'll have the subparts on there. But these are the subparts for general industry. So if we break down subpart D, which has to do with walking and working services, you can see here that the part number 1910 with the section number .21 has the definitions. .24 has fixed industrial stairs and so forth. So it's really broken down somewhat like that. Okay, so if we go to, and just kind of let's remember subpart L, and we'll just kind of talk about that. But subpart L is fire protection under general industry. So the next sheet, if you want to look at it, and it's also in your handout, it says at the top 1926 construction. And so once again, 1910, we go, oh, that's general industry. If we go general industry, we go, oh, that's 1910. So if we say construction, it's 1926, and that's the part number with regard to that. It's set up pretty much the same way, but subpart L, I do want to kind of tell you these are not synonymous. That would have been too smart probably, and maybe they did it so that we wouldn't automatically go to that area. We'd have to kind of look around. If you can remember, subpart L in general industry was fire protection. Let me check that to make sure it was fire protection. And then in subpart L in OSHA standards of construction 1926, it means scaffolds. And if we were going to look up fire protection, it would actually be up here in subpart F. And so we can see that there is a difference. So the reason I'm pointing this out to you is to be very cautious. A lot of times, not necessarily you, but students will go in and they will type in the Google search bar for OSHA, they'll type in OSHA, welding and cutting, or electrical or something like that. And it could take you to a construction part number regulation versus a general industry, or it could take you to maritime, and they're just for different purposes. So you need to make sure that you're kind of hovering and staying under the 1910 because that's what we're studying. The other thing about OSHA regulations is just because we're a general industry company doesn't mean that we wouldn't dip into or go into the construction regulations. There's several things that we could be doing at our facility that are specific to construction, and so we would go and say, okay, let's say if we wanted to do something with regard to scaffolds, we would go to subpart L, and then we would have to follow those subpart L regulations. Even though we're general industry, we do dip into, we have to follow the construction regulations. Same thing vice versa. If we look back here to the general industry, construction has to follow a lot of these as well. And so it just kind of is vice versa, and we have to make sure that we're dipping one way or the other. Okay, the next one when we look at it, this is, sorry about that, is 1915, 1917, and 1918. These are maritime industry. And once again, they're kind of set up with the part number and that type of thing, exactly as before that we've talked about. But we had subpart L is what we were looking under. It was fire protection. It was scaffolding, I think, for the constructions or scaffolds. And then here in the maritime, it says electrical machinery. And so just be leery of that. Know that could happen. Now there are 3 parts to maritime, 15, 17, and 18. They're just kind of split apart. Not sure why they did that, but that's the way that they are, just so that you kind of understand where those are. We don't necessarily get into agricultural, the standards, which we really don't talk about those, but if I were to ask a question on the quiz, it would be pertaining to 1910 general industry, 1926 construction, and 1915, 17, or 18 to maritime, and that's specific to your workbook as well. Okay, the next thing that I wanted to talk about was the OSHA standards. Like, what if there wasn't a regulation specific to that? And what OSHA does is they use something called the general duty clause. The general duty clause is out there. Essentially, this is what it says. It's kind of listed here on the screen. I'm not going to read that for you, but it does have section 5A has the employer of what they are supposed to do. One essentially says, shall furnish to each of his employees in employment a place of employment which are free of recognized hazards, and so forth. And so the second part of that, it says that the employer shall comply with all OSHA regulations under the OSHA Act when we look at it. Now, part B essentially is the employees needs to follow the regulations too. And a lot of times that's remiss, it's forgotten. But we need to make sure that we're following that as employees, and as employers we are making sure that we have a free, a injury-free workplace. And so that's where that kind of comes from. Okay, with that we're about 11 minutes, and so what I'll do is I'll go ahead and cut this off, and so this will be the end of part 2, and I will start back up with the part 3. Thanks.